Alright folks, how are we doing? It's Shabash. Welcome back to the channel where today we continue our detailed beginner guide series in Orna. We're going to be taking you through part 1 of our thief class progression in Orna, so grab your bow and dagger and join us as we take a deep dive into the class skills and passive abilities from tier 1 to tier 10, the various specialization options you want to be considering throughout, and of course which pets you want by your side. In part 2 we'll be going through itemization and gearing options at each tier, what's optimal and what's your best bargain basement alternatives. Remember, what we won't cover in this video is the most efficient playstyle to reach each tier or to level up to tier 10 in a couple of days. We all play at our own pace and have differing levels of RNG. So yeah, please feel free, leave a comment below with any queries you have. Remember to like and subscribe as well if this video helps you out and for more future Orna content. Otherwise, let's light a fire under this and get started with a quick look at the Thief class tree overview, where we can see our array of pure dodgy thief classes kind of bookends the mid-game classes, which are very much a hybrid of both warrior and thief from tier 4 to 7, and even Blademaster at tier 3. They are more like pure melee attack classes rather than pure thief classes. However, once we break out at tier 8 into tier 9 and 10, the thief classes become more dodgy, more hard hitting, and we get that early game dominating feel of the increased critical strike chance as well. That really comes into play with Realmshifter at tier 10. It's something you definitely notice at tier 2 with the rogue class and Blademaster with the critical strike passive ability, where we of course start with the tier 1 thief class, and your main skill at this level is actually going to be the attack button rather than any of the skills you learn. The thief line suffers badly from a lack of mana throughout pretty much the entire game, and at tier 1 you might be able to get 1 or 2 skills off maximum in each fight, so the attack button is really going to be our main way of causing damage. Guts is quite a good skill in later parts of the game when we have the recharge passive ability, but early on it's too inconsistent. You either crit or you miss, and we'd rather prefer some more consistent damage from the attack button or from slash, which is quite a decent skill for 10 mana. You learn at level 5, can do a little bit of nice extra damage, but then really after that, bleed you might get from your weapon anyway, and it does less damage than slash. First aid never really has that much use, I think, in the early game, and then poison and smoke bomb are good skills to have, but generally later on in the game. They're very mana intensive at this level, but in higher tiers, smoke bomb especially can be great in PvP loadouts. So at tier 1 of course we don't have any passive abilities, and that's the thief class really, so let's move on to tier 2 where we're going to check out the rogue, and immediately we have the critical hits passive ability, which is a great way of increasing our overall damage output. Remember, this only affects the attack button, which we're going to be using a lot of anyway due to our lack of mana, so this is a really good passive ability for us at this tier. It boosts our attack button damage quite significantly. Apothecarist is a very good world farming. We gain a little bit of extra juice from our healing potions and mana potions. Checking out our rogue skills then, and we start off with poison strike, which is like poison except we do some damage. I don't really rate poison that highly. I think the dot is only 2%, so it's very insignificant, especially when your enemies don't have that much health to begin with. You'll be doing 1 or 2 ticks of damage. Certainly the fire arrow skill we learn at level 30 is much better. The burn dot is 5%, which is pretty nice, and these two arrow skills, the fire arrow and ice arrow, not only do they give nice debilitating effects to our enemy, but they also are very important at the early part of the game because they give you the chance to do elemental damage to enemies which are resistant to physical damage. For example, the living armor and the mithril armor enemies, even the lesser golem enemy, they are all resistant to physical damage, so it's going to be a real slog getting through those enemies in the early game unless you got lucky with an innate elemental weapon. Otherwise we can use fire arrow, ice arrow to actually do 4 times as much damage to these enemies because they're weak to elemental damage. So if they're weak, we do double our normal damage, and if they're resistant, you do half your normal damage. So in total we'll be doing 4 times as much damage as we're using physical damage only. We then learn exploit at level 40, which is a great debuffing skill. It's good for early raiding and bosses. This will apply defense down on your enemy. And then we have double cut, which is going to be a nice farming skill, fairly cheap on the mana. And yes, this will give us more damage, probably consistently, as it's a multi-hit skill. But remember, because of our critical strikes passive, the attack button is free, and the increased critical chance. With the attack button, you never have to use mana potions, so it's really about what you like using. We're going to be flying through these early tiers anyway. The next 2 skills are going to be super important for the entire game. The stun dart and sleep dart, you'll be using these until you stop playing. Sleep dart is especially useful in the mid game against bosses. A lot of the bosses are susceptible to sleep, and you can put them to sleep. It means they're unmissable, and of course they won't be doing damage to you. That's a great way of taking down high health bosses when you're under level, under tiered as a class. I'm talking more about it in the mid game, and then towards the later part of the game when you come across very dexterous enemies who have very high dodge rates, such as the birds, the harpies, the succubus, and then of course in PvP you have typically thief classes actually, which are going to be the most dodgiest. They have Mystic Feather and naturally high dexterity, so Stun Dart and Sleep Dart are actually very much anti-thief skills, which is quite ironic. But essentially these two status effects along with freeze make your opponent unmissable, whether they have Mystic Feather and they're at 1 health, or they have incredibly high dex. If they're frozen, stunned, or asleep, it means you can't miss them. Even if you're blinded, you won't be able to miss. So bear that in mind, it's very useful knowledge to have, and these are two really amazing skills. Next we have speed, which boosts dexterity. I definitely never recommend using this. Yeah, we should never build around dexterity really, and in the early game I don't see it making too much difference. Flurry is a good 3 multi-hit skill. This would be our highest damaging skill at this point until we learn Tri-Cut. And it also has the chance to cause defense down anyway as well to our enemy, increasing our damage further. So overall, the Rogue is a great little class at tier 2. Even if you're watching this as a higher tier class, you'll definitely want to come back and get Stun Dart and Sleep Dart. Okay, so tier 3 Battlemaster, we begin the early to mid game hybrid classes in that we can wear all gear types with the Blademaster class, including mage gear actually for some reason. I guess we are true masters of battle then actually. Anyway, this is a great class with nice passive for early game and great skills that actually last well into the late game as well. We keep the critical strikes passive, meaning we can keep using the attack button with the extra damage output from slightly more crits. It's not a deal breaker, but if you're out of mana in PvP, it's definitely useful with 0 mana cost obviously. Apothecarist gets us another 25% more healing of HP and mana from our potions. Very nice for world farming, in my opinion. Experience step is alright if you like walking, I guess, but it's never going to be a deal breaker. It's not going to out-level killing mobs. Maybe there's a crazy challenge in there for someone. Anyway, the first skill we learn then is Battle Dance at level 50, which is okay sometimes and frustrating at others. It's got a 25% chance per stat to boost a stat, and this boosts single up for the 5 base stats. That's defense, resistance, attack, magic, and dexterity as well. Basically, the less stats you have up, the more chance this skill has of proccing a single up for one of those stats. So basically, at the start of a fight, it's a very good chance you're likely going to get between 1 and 3 single stat ups straight away. But then after that, the problem starts, and if you didn't get your attack up, which is the main one we're usually after here, the chance is much lower now, and it might take a few turns to proc the remaining stats up, and it's probably best just to use Warcry to get that single attack up by itself. And then at level 55 we learn the excellent double edge skill. This has incredibly high defense penetration relative to our level at this point in the game. It can actually be used to do some damage to much higher tier raid bosses. You won't get any gear drops from them, but you can still get things like potions and even more importantly gauntlet keys from, for example, Titan and the Baylor Elite raids. You only need to do 1 bit of damage, at least 1 HP of damage, and then you're in with a chance of getting some gauntlet keys. Try it out, you might be surprised if you're below level. Otherwise, it obviously does great damage for a single hit skill, and it will get you through most defenses you'll encounter at around this level, and it only costs 25 mana. You just got to watch out for the 10% self damage that you're going to give yourself. Cyclone we learn at level 65 then. It's a good multi-hit skill. It'll be our highest hitting skill that we learn until getting Tri-Cut 10 levels later. Cyclone also regularly procs stunned status effect on your enemy, which is good. Causes them to miss turns and makes them unmissable as well. And then finally we learn Tri-Cut at level 75, a great skill that will last long into the game. I'm still using this in dungeons at tier 10. I've actually reached tier 11 now, and I still use it. Great damage and great mana efficiency as well. Of course, you have low damage penetration, but at this level in the early game will normally be okay as long as we're using a weapon that's around the same tier and we're not lagging too far behind. Just make sure your weapon is up to scratch, and by this point we can buy whetstones and find whetstones immediately, leveling our weapon to level 3. Moving on to tier 4 then, we have the attack melee low tier god, which is the Adept class. It's a hybrid of warrior and thief, and although the mystic class is also technically a hybrid of thief and mage, you don't actually learn any attack skills with the mystic class, and neither does spell sword for warrior actually, so Adept is really our only choice here for attack and melee builds. It also learns solid skills. The best one got to be barrier 2, a great defensive skill which is a guarantee that gives us single up defense and resistance in 1 turn. Actually, many other builds are going to come back and pick up Adept for this very skill. Damage skills we learn are all second versions of previously learned skills, all giving a little bit of extra damage, also costing much more mana as well. In Orna, In general, the increased mana cost from the upgraded skills are not going to give the same increase in power. So for example, what I mean, charge 2 here costs twice as much mana as the charge 1 skill, but it's not going to do twice as much damage. A real benefit actually comes in PvP defense, where the AI that controls your defense has unlimited mana. But of course, sometimes we want the highest damaging skill possible, and we aren't worried about mana efficiency. Just as thief classes, we tend to have less mana, and this kind of becomes more important to think about for thief builds. Flurry 2 can also give defense down on your enemy, while Tricot 2 will do the most damage providing your attack is high enough compared to your enemy's defense. Flurry 2 and Tricot 2 both being multi-hit skills. Moving on to the passive abilities of Adept, we have the exact same continued on from the Blademaster. Critical strikes means we don't have to panic when running out of mana. The attack button will still be a very valid option or a last resort in PvP. Again, experience step is barely noticeable, certainly not going to help during COVID-19 I guess. And then Apothecarist gives us an extra squeeze of juice from our potions. Nice little buff to world farming and raiding. Generally, the Adept is a really solid generalist attack class at tier 4, giving you flexibility for gearing, and of course the main boon being the barrier 2 skill, one of the best defensive skills in the game. So now at tier 5 we have our only real choice to make with regards to which class to play. Both of the Dragoon and Majestic are hybrid classes, and both lead to the tier 6 Blademaster. So don't worry, you can't really make a wrong decision here at all. Both Dragoon and Majestic classes are more than viable for our attack-based build at this stage in the game. The way I normally recommend people choose one of these classes is actually down to the following things. Firstly, thematically, if you like a Dragon Slayer archetype rather than an elemental class, and as long as you can play fairly actively to kill a few dragons to keep your charges up for Dragon's Vengeance, you go with Dragoon. On the other hand, if you love elemental-based archetypes, the Majestic class learns the upgraded second versions of the elemental strike skills. Secondly, based purely on playstyle and activity, if you were like me and kill lots of mobs in the world as a regular couch farmer, Dragoon is a great choice, as you can keep your Dragon's Vengeance skills supercharged, and they become the hardest hitting skills at this point in the game. Each dragon kill increases your power by about 2%, I believe, and remember, as you increase your attack with the buffs in battle, you need more dragons to reach your full potential for Dragon's Vengeance. You can check the hidden info guide on Orna guide website for more details on charges. I'll link that in the description below. Finally, if you're less active in killing monsters, then the Majestic class will likely be your best choice. Basically, you have a higher floor than the Dragoon class with damage, but you have less ceiling. You're going to be doing more consistent good damage. You don't need to spend a good bit of time killing tens and tens of dragons to get good power boost for your elemental 2 skills. So with that said, let's take a closer look at each class individually, starting with the Majestic. Our passives, we have the first Eternal Light passive, which is a charge passive that works by basically having the game open. No extra killing required. Also gives view distance and night vision. Means we don't need to use torches at nighttime. And we get the continuation of the critical hits passive, which some would suggest is the truer thief archetype choice. In general, these passes are probably slightly stronger than Dragoons. Skill wise, as mentioned before, we learn the second elemental strike skills at level 100, giving us a lot more oomph with our faction hits especially, and elemental damage. We also get the Dark and Holy Strike 2 skills at level 110. These are slightly less useful, honestly. I guess Holy Strike is useful if you're playing at nighttime. A lot of the nighttime mobs are weak to Holy, but you're likely not going to need any extra damage. At level 105 we learn Fortify 3, which gives us a massive 7 turns of ward. Actually a really great skill. A lot of people use this later on in the game to build up ward turns in dungeons and raids as fast as possible. Remember, ward absorption is based on the maximum percentage absorption skill that you've used in that fight. So for example, if you've used Ward of Mithril in the fight, you'll always absorb 75% of damage to ward, regardless of which skills you then use afterwards to increase your ward turns. We then learn the second Osmo Strike and Omni Strike skills on leaving the tier at level 125. Again, these add more damage to the utility, have good defense penetration as well. Osmo Strike heals you, while Omni Strike potentially lowers enemy stats. I tend to use Omni Strike 1 actually to lower enemy stats, as it's the cheapest mana wise, and I think it has the same proc rates as Omni Strike 2 and 3 anyway. In contrast, however, I'll actually use the highest Osmo Strike skill available to me in order to heal as much as possible. Neither of these will be your highest damage output skills, so use them accordingly. Finally, we learn Arcane Strikes, also at level 125, and I guess this is kind of the Majestic equivalent to the Dragoon's Dragon Vengeance 2 skill, taking 2 turns in battle. The problem with this skill is it's a multi-hit and therefore has very low damage penetration. However, if you know you've got high attack relative to your opponent, you can use this as a nice nuke spell. Alright, let's look at Dragoon's passive abilities now, and the stat boosting charge we mentioned before is Dragon Slayer, and you should have guessed by now we charge this up by killing dragons. Doesn't take many kills to charge up this passive and reach the maximum stat boost of 20%, I think it is, the same for all classes at this tier. And we also have the Valhallan Way passive, which slightly raises our pet's action rate and power. Now I'd say it's not incredibly noticeable at this tier, but if you've got the Wisp pet, you may notice a bit more timely healing at least. One of the first skills we learn at level 100 then is the big one, Dragon's Vengeance. Again, this gets charged by killing dragons, but note the charging is separate from the passive ability Dragon Slayer. They charge the same way by killing dragons, but they are separate things. They have their own charge rates. Dragon's Vengeance requires many more dragon kills to reach maximum potential. The ceiling is also pushed higher when you boost your attack stats in battle. When fully charged, however, this skill wrecks absolutely everything. You will feel like a true Dragon Slayer with the power you gain, and then just wait until you unlock Dragon's Vengeance 2. Flare is an unstable dragon element mage skill, so unless you're playing hybrid magic for the banter, we won't be using this as a thief. We learn a new good ward skill, Rampart 3, which is like a budget-friendly Ward of Mithril, granting 75% absorption and a couple of ward turns. Pretty nice if you're playing defensively. At this stage in the game, I prefer to go full attack mode when leveling though, and it's entirely down to personal preference. We also learn a dragon element attack skill finally with Blight Strike. This is a great wee skill, especially if you haven't found Dragon Strike from an Arcanist yet. It's probably going to be our first dragon elemental strike skill. So this potentially applies Blight to your enemy, and it's great in PvP, as the most common way of getting Blight immunity is with the Blight Pendant, but that isn't available to find until tier 6, and the Wisp's Heal skill doesn't cure Blight. These next few skills are generally for magic users. Wyvern Speed grants magic and dex single ups. It's not guaranteed, by the way. If you want the version that can give attack as well, it's Wyvern Speed 2, learned from the Dragon Knight, but remember that's not a guaranteed stat up as well for some reason. Dragon's Breath and Flare 2 are both magic spells that deal fire and dragon damage respectively. Finally, that leaves us with Dragon's Vengeance 2, an absolute beast of a skill if you can keep up dragons for maximum charge. This hits crazy hard. It takes 2 turns in battle. If you check the hidden info guide, we can see we need 300 dragon kills for this to be fully charged, and even more if your weapon had your faction element. 375 dragons actually, which is 25% more. Same relatively to your faction bonus. And this skill will last you well into the next tier if you're keeping your charges high. Solid hitting nuke spell. Alright, the tier 6 Blademaster. This is where we become a tad more roguelike, in that we can't wear mage gear anymore, although warrior gear is still available for us for this class. And finally the tier 7 Magistrate class as well, before we finally specify as pure thief. Blademaster is most infamous for its second chance passive. This occasionally procs in battle as your last chance, letting you live with 1 HP instead of falling in battle. This is the first time in the game that you'll come across this passive, and it can be quite infuriating to play against. A good counter to second chance, by the way, is getting a dot on the enemy such as burn, bleed, poison, as this will actually tick damage on the AI controlled defense before they attack, causing them to die instantly. The Crest of Avalon is the stat charging passive for the Blademaster, and you'll see what level of charge you have in the main character screen, and fully charged will increase your stats by I think 20%. Skill wise, we learn a great mix of single hit utility skills as well as multi-hit damaging skills. First, Horizontal Slash can lower your opponent's defense while giving you 1 turn of ward. This can be useful for maintaining your ward turns after using something like Ward of Mithril or even Rampart 3. Riposte works in a similar way by giving you 1 ward turn, but can proc temporary attack and defense up for you. So this can be good in dungeons or raids if you're utilizing ward in a more defensive build, or even if you're playing down the warrior line, it's good, and also for pet builds with attack based pets. X Slash is a great skill, not really because of the damage, which is fairly subpar, and it has low defense penetration, but because it has a high proc rate for the bleed. Exactly what we want, as we said, for taking down last chance enemies. I regularly use this in my tier 10 PvP loadouts actually. Bleed is also very hard to build equipment immunity for. Then at level 140 we get the big one, Swordplay. This is a 3-hit skill that has the potential to give you temporary single ups to the 4 main stats, defense, resistance, attack and magic, while at the same time proccing the opposite, temporary single downs for each of those on your opponent. It does have bad defense penetration like all multi-hit skills as we've talked about, but we should have a good attack stat relative to our enemies, so this will be our highest damaging skill at this point in the game. Fantastic raiding skill. I especially recommend using a mirror offhand to get heaps of extra mana. That will allow you to dish out really great DPS magnified by lots of temporary attack ups as well. Finally, we enter the next tier learning Coup de Grace, a 3-turn hard-hitting skill that never misses. It's probably most useful as a nuke in PvP, particularly against Grand Mystics at this tier when they have the Mystic Feather procced as they're below half health, or against bosses indeed as well. The multi-turn charge up does leave you vulnerable, so bear that in mind. Have a play about with it in certain situations to see if you like it. It's obviously not going to have the same consistent damage output as swordplay, however. So now the hybrid of Thief and Warrior classes come to its grand conclusion at tier 7 with the Majistrate, an elite elemental force of Anwen. We immediately learn the elemental strike 3 skills at level 150. Using your relevant faction strike is going to be your new hardest hitting 1-turn skill, and these become very useful actually in tier 9 against the fallen god bosses as well, especially when you're doing those boss dungeons hunting for your Aethric blade. Definitely also worth having your faction strike in your PvP loadout in case your opponents are not resistant, and they'll be crushed pretty fast. Again, the Dark and Holy Strike 3 skills will rarely be more than situational skills on later tiers against weak to that specific element enemies. The tier 9 Kraken boss is weak to Holy, and the tier 10 Lioness mobs, including King Gradlin, actually is now weak to Dark, so you might find a use for those skills later in the game there, perhaps against Berserk mobs, or if you're yet to find a strong enough weapon. Osmo Strike 3 at level 165 is going to be our predominant life healing spell now. It hits really hard with good defense penetration and returns 25% health, great for going deep into raids. Omni Strike 3 is more expensive mana cost, and as far as I know it has the same proc chance to lower your opponent's stats as the first Omni Strike skill, as we talked about earlier. So for that purpose, I would actually still use Omni Strike 1 to lower stats on your enemy, as it's more mana efficient and we're not using these skills for damage. Finally, we learn Arcane Strikes 2 at level 175 going into tier 8, and it's basically the upgraded version of Arcane Strikes learned from the Majestic class. Continuing that theme of Anwen forces, and lore-wise arcane damage is thus strong to Baylor forces. So in reality, those Baylor mobs, for example the Gateway in tier 7 and the tier 9 mobs and Baylor King, aren't really anywhere near strong enough that you're going to feel the need to use arcane damage to kill them. And for pretty much every other situation, there's much better skills to be used rather than this one. It's a 3-turn multi-hitting skill with terrible damage penetration. So checking Magistrate passive abilities, now we get critical strikes back, although it isn't extremely useful in the mid game. Remember, the attack button does have very high defense penetration though, so if you're up against a high defense opponent, remember to use the attack button, and we get the extra critical chance here and there as well, which is always welcome. We also get the Steadfast passive, which is really nice. It's one of those passives that you don't know what you're missing until you go from a class with Steadfast to playing a class without it. Raids such as Baylor Elite will now become a breeze. It also opens up your accessory slots a bit more, as you can rely on Steadfast to prevent status afflictions happening to you regularly. Our final passive is Eternal Light, which makes a return. It's the same as Majestic, and basically charges up by just playing and having the game open to increase your stats. Remember, it also gives you like a permanent torch effect, including view distance, but it acts as its own source of view distance, so it does actually stack with torches. So at tier 8 we can now finally leave the hybrid melee attack classes behind and recharge ourselves back into pure thief class mode with the Arcanic at tier 8. Continuing on with the lore, as a deadly rogue of Anwen, we are immune to arcane damage and can now only wear thief equipment. Let's start off with the affinity skills, which these override the element of your weapon. Very useful, especially at this tier when you're using one of the dragon boss weapons from Tiamat or Typhon, for example. Using the affinity of your faction will mean your normal skills that use weapon element will now do 25% extra damage for you due to that faction bonus. Obviously going to be great for raiding and also possibly dungeons where these bosses will last for the entire duration. The no affinity skill will simply move a previously used affinity skill. Ward of Anwen is a cheap way of getting the 4 basic elemental resistances, which is obviously good and useful against certain raid bosses later on, such as the Morrigan. Its only drawback is the proc rate is quite low actually. You may end up with 150 ward turns before proccing all 4 resistances. But that might not necessarily be a bad thing, I guess, just something to bear in mind. We then learn Quad Cut level 190, which is an efficient multi-hit skill great for DPS, and then learn Swordblade 2 at level 195. Swordblade 2 does do more damage than Quad Cut, and it gives the same temporary buffs and debuffs to yourself and your enemy. but it does cost 45 more mana than quad cut. So for raiding, I actually like to fit both of them in at this point and use them both in a complementary fashion, as one gives you the temporary buffs while the other one is slightly more mana efficient for dishing out the damage. If you're Bard spec, you're going to have Warrior's Dance skill, which is only 35 mana actually, and you'll probably be using that instead of quad cut. Finally, we learn the Arcane Strikes 3 skill at level 200, and I would just copy and paste what I said previously about the Arcane Strikes 2. For passives as Arcanic, we get a slightly improved stat charging ability in Eternal Light 2. I think the stat gain fully charged is an extra 5%, now totaling 25%. We also get a unique passive in Arcane Mastery. This gives us the chance to proc status afflictions on our enemy when using physical skills. This is fantastic, especially in PvP, where you're going to want to be using the physical elemental skill anyway, as people at this point in the game should soon be concentrating on equipping elemental resistance gear. Apothecaries 2 now gets us an extra 50% juice from potions. Very nice for cheapskates like me using the lowest versions of potions as possible. Great for world farming obviously, and can help you in getting back to full health quicker after taking a big hit in raids. Mystic Feather is back finally, and we can now definitely feel like a real rogue now. This works independently from dexterity miscalculations and basically gives you an extra chance to dodge when you go below half your health, increasing your chance closer to 0 HP that you are. It's an amazing passive for PvP. It can be so clutch in many fights for you. Just beware the status afflictions that prevent mischance entirely and guarantee hits even when blinded. Sleep, stunned, and freeze. And also I read the other day, maybe petrified, better check on that. We also come across Recharge. For the first time, this gains us back 25% HP and mana on a critical strike. That can be a crit from either a skill or from the attack button, and this makes Lunge a good option skill for hard dungeons as an example. And then speaking of crits, we also continue to have the critical hits passive yet again. Interestingly, we now switch lore forces in tier 9 with the next class, an elusive assassin of Baelor, meaning that we lose the Eternal Light passive that was linked to the Anwin lore. We are now immune to dark attacks however, very useful against Apollyon's common nightmare skill. Our new charge passive is Dungeon Crawler, increasing our stats as we kill monsters in dungeons. Effectively, we only really need to do one dungeon a day to keep this fully charged, which you should definitely be doing by this point by the way. Boss dungeons ideally to find that Ithra's Blade, we'll talk more about that in a second. We get 4 other fantastic passives as well, Steadfast and Mystic Feather we've already talked about in detail in this video. We also get Life Siphon to recover HP on quite a regular basis. This is a fantastic passive for raiding, and we also have the new Saboteur passive, which is really solid, mainly in PvP as Ward starts to become a more prominent part of the meta in these higher levels. Saboteur absolutely shreds Ward as it does double damage against it, and we can even lower their defensive stats as well. So you're going to love this against Titan Guards, Omnimancers as well, and of course higher tier 10 enemies which are using Ward as well. For skills, we first learn Elementalist, which is actually a little bit misleading unfortunately. It works like an affinity spell, but it actually makes your weapon do physical damage, not pure elementalists, such as the Drain or Bolt mage spells if you're familiar with them. Thanks to Major in the Discord who corrected me on this the other week, and I tested it myself and that's how it's currently working. So Elementalist actually gives physical element to your weapon. It's obviously still a useful skill to have, especially if you have an Ithra's Blade for example and you're not the Frozen Guard faction. You probably want to be doing physical damage in PvP and also against certain raid bosses like the Fey Yeti who casts Prism Wall. Osmo Strikes is a multi-hitting healing skill with the potential to do more damage and thus more healing than Osmo Strike 3, but remember, like most multi-hit skills, it has almost no defense penetration, and a similar story for Omni Strikes that we learn at 210 as well. We then learn Quad Cut 2 and Swordplay 3 at levels 215 and 220 respectively. With enough mana, we'll probably be using Swordplay 3 more as our spammable damage dealing skill in raids, as we benefit from the temporary buffs more and deal massive damage with our naturally high attack stat. Obviously if you're the Charmer spec by now, you'll mainly be using Warrior's Pavane skill with a sprinkling of Swordplay 3 here and there if you fancy the buffs. These skills paired with the Life Siphon passive make Nyx probably the best raiding class at tier 9. Finally, Ward of Baelor is a similar skill to Ward of Anwin, except it also grants you resistance to Holy and Dark as well. This gets outclassed by Ward of Baelor 2 learned by the Gilgamesh in tier 10 by the way. The proc rates on that are much higher with the second skill, but you know Ward of Baelor 1 is still a good cheap way to gain resistances while also saving on skill slots. And the last thing about Nyx I want to mention is with this great class, probably my little pet peeve with it is the lack of great bow weapon proficiency with the Nyx, which makes gearing a tiny bit less diverse. Obviously Ithra's Blade is still going to be your number one goal, But there's also the Mighty Tempest, which drops from Mighty Griffin Boss, and it would be a great thief weapon, but we don't get the weapon proficiency with it. And at this point, because we have higher attack stats, losing out on the weapon bonus is going to cost us quite a significant amount of attack as we start to go deeper into 4-figure attack stats. Still a great tier 9 class, however. So the end of the Thief Road returns back to Anduin with the tier 10 Realmshifter class. A great climax to the Thief class tree progression in my opinion. We get the highest base attack in the game, meaning that with the right spec we can push attack to absurd levels before even buffing in battle. We also get much better weapon proficiency with the long awaited addition of great bows as well as swords, opening up our weapon options further. Not to mention the increased critical damage for being the Realmshifter, which is a 2.5 multiplier now instead of the normal 2. We are also immune to dark and holy damage completely, and with our Realm's Light passive we can see in the dark, equivalent to using a torch, but it also grants us view distance, which as we've said before can stack with using a torch by the way. And also a tiny addition that makes this passive useful in battle is that we can occasionally cause blind on our opponents. Let's now talk about our battle buff passive Resurgence. This acts linearly from 50% down to 0% health, and like the other tier 10 battle buffs excluding deity, eventually provides a 20% increase to all our stats at full charge. This grants us maximum power at low health, providing us with quite a challenging yet immensely rewarding playstyle. If you're a fan of world farming and killing lots of mobs like me, you can set a 1 HP one-shotting pretty much everything that pops up except Berserk Chimeras maybe, until you get good weapons, and the new Arisen mobs as well. It's super fast. In raids we can hide behind ward using pets like Orichalcum Golem to regenerate ward for us while we dish out reams of damage. Sitting at low HP in Resurgence range is known commonly in the community as redlining. If you ever come across it, you just got to be mindful of those dots. Also in PvP, a misplaced hit from our opponent can leave us on low health, giving us the chance to end them. This works really well with the buffed Saboteur 2 passive, which now gives us a 2.25 multiplier against ward, putting Realmshifter in a solid place against the ward meta at tier 10. Adding on the Mystic Feather passive, and we really become savage to deal with at low health. Recharge 2 is great to have as we can build around trying to proc it when we need to. For example, when using multi-hit skills we're never going to crit unless using Realm Strikes, so if we want to stay low health we can use them, whereas if we're doing something like hard mode dungeons we can use a skill like Sortie or Lunge to regain our mana, and then a cheap skill like Double Edge to work back down into Resurgence range. Finally, we get Apothecarist 3, which doubles the effectiveness of potions on us, and you might need a little bit of time to get used to the crazy healing this can provide. I saw someone pair this with the Fey Yeti horns, and I think a Panacea healed them for like 40,000 health or something. Sorry, I can't remember who it was. Pretty crazy. So my favorite Realmshifter skills we actually learn immediately at level 225. Sortie is a hard-hitting, good defense penetrating, yet cheap skill which can also crit. I think anecdotally the crit rate is between 15 and 20%. You're likely going to start to receive a few turn 1 sorties to the face in the arena, and trust me, they do hurt when they crit. Sortie has a place in all my attack-based PvP and also world and dungeon loadouts. It even holds our ward turns steady, making it useful for other classes, and especially if we're using the Cataphract spec or of course the Gilgamesh class. Realm Strikes is the one of only a few multi-hit attack skills that can crit, giving it huge damage potential. It does come with a 15% miss chance to balance this. Still, it's a very fun skill to use. We all love seeing crazy damage numbers. We then learn the upgraded multi-hitting Osmo Strikes 2 and Omni Strikes 2, again doing more damage while applying their healing or stat lowering effects respectively. Still got to bear in mind that they still have that low defense penetration. We then learn Evasive Strikes at level 230, which is interesting in the fact that it gives us a rare instance of increased temporary crit chance. Remember, that only affects the attack button. I've recently seen this utilized in an interesting hard mode dungeon build by Tyres Dunexit, the Sage of Swash, using Evasive Strikes and the attack button to quite devastating effect actually. Speaking about temporary buffs, Realm Shift can actually proc double ups and downs of the basic stats. Super interesting one-term temp buffing skill. You might want to use immunity gear to prevent your defense and your resistance getting shredded, also your attack of course. This allows us to get even more crazy high damage numbers if you proc the double attack up. bear in mind the double ups are going to be much rarer than the single ups. Same goes for downs. I actually prefer Realmshift to the final skill we learn as Realmshifter, which is Bloodshift at 235. Bloodshift can only proc the single ups of the basic 4 stats, but it also gives temp crit as well. However, it also gives us a unique dot which cannot be cured, so don't use this at maximum resurgence power. I've personally only really used Realmshift over this skill for that chance of the double stat ups, and it's fairly easy to mitigate the stat downs anyway. Alright, so that concludes the Thief class progression tree, and just to give you a taste of what endgame damage numbers can look like, I hit over 2 million with Realm Strikes against Pumpkinhead back in October. Unfortunately, I actually lost the original footage, but this GIF is the last remaining proof, and it lives on. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a video going up over the setup required for a massive Realm Shifter hit like this. Now let's move on then to the supplementary classes we will also want to unlock, and it's fairly standard to be honest, especially if you've watched my other class progression videos up till now. The tier 5 Druid class is mandatory for Golem's Fortitude, giving double defense and resistance ups. Just watch for the attack down. You'll definitely want to have a way to fix that or prevent it. We also of course have the double attack up from either Mimic's Mischief and Bear's Might. I'd say for most people you want to try and get Druid immediately after getting your tier 7 class, which is going to be Magistrate in this case. If you've accumulated enough Orns beforehand by doing lots of quests or achievements for example, or whatever, then obviously feel free to pick the Druid up sooner. We then have the Atlas Vanguard at tier 8, mainly for the Divine Bastion skill. This allows us to hide behind 100% ward absorption, which is going to be quite important for a lot of Realmshifter builds. We can later transition to Titan Guard's Divine Bastion 2 spell. We also learn the individual elemental ward skills here, which can be useful to plug in gaps, but as Thief classes generally, we're pretty short on skill slots as is. We then also want to get our respective faction god classes, both the tier 8 and eventually the tier 9 version. We get the special god elemental strike skills. For example, for Earth it's Terra Strike. These are exceptionally hard hitting, really great defense, penetration and damage. Gives you 2 turns of ward and a little bit of healing as well. Really solid skills. We also get the Daethric channel at 225, which can obviously be quite frustrating to use, especially as Realmshifter. We usually have good enough consistent multi-hit damage anyway to go far enough in raids without using Daethric channel. But anyway, you know, it's better to have the option of DC and choose whether to use it or not as a personal preference. Finally, the only other mandatory supplementary class pickup is going to be Beowulf, and you don't need to do this until level 230. Specifically for the Gate of Gunner buff skill. This grants us 50% attack buff while basically reducing your magic and resistance to 0. Basically, it reduces by 90%. Certain specs aren't going to care about that anyway. Gate of Gunner really boosts our damage potential, and for most things we want to try and destroy our opponents before they can actually hit us against our defenses anyway. Now moving on to specializations, remember our first spec in Orna for each character is always free, and in general it doesn't take too long to reach level 100, so I recommend skipping a tier 3 spec, saving those 25,000 Orns we would need to spend at tier 5, and go immediately to select the Berserker spec at tier 5. Now I always recommend Berserker purely because of the insane power boost we get from the Berserk 1 skill. That increases all of our damage by 50%. Nothing else at this tier provides you with that much power, and the 5% dot self-inflicting damage is very manageable with potions and even Osmo Strike 1 at this level. Honestly, this is going to be a perfect setup for charging through boss dungeons where we can grab some great loot, good weapons, and also for raiding. Berserker is that strong you can even stick with it until tier 9 if you really want to. One other option I'll mention at tier 5 is going to be the Hunter spec, which gives us a nice 10% boost to our health. We also get the Great Bow weapon proficiency, and this is useful if you find a nice Hurricane Arc from a Griffin for example. The Arrow Storm and Full Bend skills certainly do a good amount of damage as well. It's not going to be as powerful as using Berserk 1 though. Finally, I'll also mention the recent Duelist spec that's been added recently. I guess if you find 2 really good weapons you might consider this. The spec Dual Wielding was recently buffed, so it only reduces the stats of each weapon by 45% instead of the original 55% on release, and when you spec into Duelist you also gain an extra 15% to your total offensive stats as well. The skills here are not really very useful I think, unless perhaps you're considering using different elements is the only real thing I can think of. If you've got proc chance from weapons that cause status afflictions, they do stack together. I guess not many people have really played about with the spec too much at this point. Now at tier 7 then, our options start to open up and diversify. You can of course still stick with the Berserker spec if you like. I'll first mention the Bard spec, which we use for extra mana, and the ultra mana efficient Warrior's Dance skill, which does deal a lot of damage and is only 35 mana, really pretty crazy. You also get weapon proficiency to instruments and can occasionally cause the lull status effect in battle to your opponent, and this basically causes them to lose turns in battle. I haven't looked into too much detail to see if Bard is faster at raiding overall than Berserker. I'd imagine they're actually pretty close, to be honest, as obviously you have to mana pot less with Bard. I'd say if you're considering Ranger spec as well, to try Bard instead. It might not make sense, but the Warrior's Dance skill is actually much better than Arrowstorm 2 and Full Bend 2, and it's obviously going to be much more mana effective. We then of course need to mention Swash. Swashbuckler is less of a spec and more of a special class, more of a lifestyle in itself. It becomes available to us at tier 7, and this is such an amazing spec. It's so diverse and it definitely deserves an entire video in its own right, as I'll only really cover the basics of it here. Basically, the lower our defense stat, the higher our attack stat is raised to a maximum boost of 50%. And that is a global attack stat boost, including all your gains from equipment and gear, and obviously it stacks with your origin town bonus, party bonus, things like that, etc. Every class has a defense threshold which you need to get under to receive your maximum attack bonus. And I don't have the exact numbers, but it's usually just below net 0 defense gain from your equipment. As your defense goes a little bit higher, then the attack boost will drop slowly and then start dropping significantly. Looking something like this graph, credit to Ollie for producing this lovely infographic. Eventually, if you have too much defense, you'll have 0 attack boost whatsoever. Now, because Swash builds are based around 0 defense, it makes a lot of normal stat gear redundant, meaning you have to look for viable alternatives and not just chase the biggest stat numbers. If you think about it, this actually opens up a much wider array of gear choices to us. Things that give status immunity, for example, are a very common fix. There's way too much detail surrounding the Swash lifestyle to go into in this video, as I mentioned. What I would say is that it might be best to wait until tier 8 to start swashing, as you do get more gear that reduces defense available to us, things like cursed rings and coral gear. If you want to learn more about Swash, there's a fantastic Discord server set up by the Swash legend Lenith Valkyrie. If you join the main Orna Discord server and just ask for directions, there's always plenty of Swashies on hand to point you in the right direction. Now, in my experience, Swash tends to get better as you get further into the game. As a reference, my current highest attack stat with Swash at the time of making this video is 9,522. People don't tend to last very long, but neither do I. So yeah, we'll definitely have to make another guide video focusing specifically on Swash in the future. Stay tuned for that. Now at tier 9, our main 2 new spec options are going to be Charmer and Cataphract. Assassin we'll talk about. It can be an option, but I feel it lacks a little bit in utility in comparison to the other two. Both of its passive stack additively with Realmshifters rather than multiplicatively. So for example, Assassinate with Saboteur and Last Breath with Resurgence. You can also occasionally proc Temp Defense Triple Down on your enemy, which is not defendable against, by the way. You can't get immunity to triple downs, and it's more like a mini Realmshifter, and I personally feel we can gain more overall by increasing our utility with the other specs. While you're still the Nyx class, you can probably still give Raider a go. The Life Siphon passive works really well with the increased dot from Berserk 3, which is quite hefty at 15%. You also get a little bit of increase to base attack, 20%. It's not too bad actually, but you do lose 20% health, which is significant. So at this tier, your main focus is probably raiding Apollyon if you're in an active kingdom, and Raider will probably be somewhat better than Berserker, as Berserk 3 also raises your defensive stats, allowing you to go deeper. But the damage is going to be pretty similar anyway. So the next spec we'll talk about is going to be Cataphract. It's a very common spec at higher tiers and plays into the ward meta, which is pretty rampant in tier 10 at the moment. It obviously helps if you have ward gear available to you already, but Cataphract going to give you additional ward turns, and ward is automatically activated at the start of battle. You also get ward regen every turn, and we have 12% increase to our base health, and we also get the Prism Wall skill, giving us resistance to the 4 basic elements. Remember, as Realmshifter, you're obviously going to be already immune to Holy and Dark, so this complements it quite nicely. Cataphract is certainly a very viable option if you want more survivability, and it's obviously going to give you more ward than using Charmer if you need it. Let's talk about Charmer then. Charmer was recently buffed actually, and now it's got one of the most bonkers skills in the game, this Warrior's Pavane. This is like Warrior's Dance skill from Bard but on steroids. I think it's the highest potential damaging multi-turn attack skill in the game, apart from like a Realm Strike's crit maybe. It only costs 60 mana. It's very efficient, as we also gain extra mana as Charmer, remember, which is very useful to thief classes, as we know by now. Realm Charmer is definitely one of the best, if not the best, current raiding build in the game. You hide behind ward with an Orichalcum Golem pet, or a Fey Yeti if you picked one up this November. You get down to low health for Resurgence, then you use Warrior's Purveying to cause savage damage. The output is just ridiculous, it's really fun. You definitely want Divine Bastion for 100% ward absorption, and you need to watch out for dots at low health if you're not immune to them. As a little trick, if you're doing this after buffing up and say you pop back up to 100% health, but you're now fully warded up, you're fully buffed up, what you can use is the double edge skill, which takes 10% of your health away. But if your total HP pool doesn't end in a 0, the 10% gets rounded down, so you can use double edge 10 times and you're going to end up with a near single figure health wise. Basically, you're going to be at maximum resurgent power. So definitely give Realm Charmer a go. As a Charmer spec, we also get the Lull 2, which basically gives you more chance to proc the Lull effect on our opponents, causing them to miss a few turns. Now moving on to pets, and as usual we start with the tier 4 Wisp pet, as it gives the great wee heal of 300 HP, which is great at this point in the game. Also cures a few negative status afflictions. All other pet damage at this point isn't really very significant, but the 300 HP Wisp heal is, so that's why it's so often recommended by pretty much everyone. We then upgrade our Wisp at tier 7 with the Twilight Wisp. We're kind of still following the classic pet healer line at this point. The Twilight Wisp can now attack and do a decent bit of dark and holy damage, as well as having the Wisp's Heal 1 skill. We now have the Wisp's Heal 2 skill available, which will restore 1000 HP, which is really very significant indeed, and using both of them together we'll have very consistent healing. At some point you'll also want to pick up a Greater Yokai tier 6 pet. This is mainly for PvP purposes. It's got a whole array of debuffing skills which are especially potent against other thief classes actually. Not a priority for new characters going through the game at around tier 6, 7, 8. Probably better to come back later to pick this up, unless you like causing a bit of mayhem on ward defense in the mid game, or if you like charging through the arena. Back to tier 7, and there's a couple of pets you also want to pick up here. The first one probably is going to be the Warhorse, which is great for raiding if we feel we can do without the Twilight Wisp's healing. Goes great with Magistrate and the Steadfast passive. Warhorse actually does decent damage by itself, but the main boon to this pet is that it can also proc a defense double down on your enemy permanently, which of course stacks with temporary defense downs. The only bad thing of course is it can definitely take quite a bit of time for this to get procced, but when it does, your multi-hit skills are going to be doing basically their maximum potential in damage. We also want to pick up the Orichalcum Golem as a tier 7 pet. You can probably come back to this and pick it up later once you've got ward gear in tier 9 and tier 10, and especially when you're focusing on playing Realmshifter Charmer. That's where this pet really shines. Ori Golem gives the most ward regeneration from any pet in the game with its multiple ward skills. It also gives you the 4 basic elemental ward skills eventually, as well as infinite ward turns. So this is probably most important to use when you're doing Realmshifter Charmer. At tier 8 then, we also pick up the Pale Dragon whenever it shows up. It's a really solid support pet. Dispel heals pretty much all your negative status afflictions which you can get, and those really do slow us down due to missed turns in the long run. We also have the Miracle Spell, which is used very regularly. It's a great little support skill, gives you a small heal of 250 HP, but it also gives you temporary defense and resistant single ups. You're not necessarily going to be using Pale Dragon all the time, but you definitely want to have it as an option. Now at tier 10, the first pet we'll talk about is Chimera, which is obviously used for its Berserk 1 ability, which gives us 50% increased defensive stats. It's the same skill that you get with the Berserker spec. We do need to be a little more careful than other classes when using this as Realmshifter because of our Resurgence battle passive that gets stronger the lower health we have. We want to be redlining in general, so being at low health is going to be very common for us. You'll need to keep a much closer eye and monitor your health when using Chimera. Definitely don't use this pet if you're planning on redlining at low HP and hiding behind ward. Chimera definitely still does have its use cases however. The other really great pet for us at tier 10 is going to be the Mighty Mimic, which will almost always cast Mimic's Mischief on turn 1, giving us of course the double attack up. It sometimes rarely doesn't cast it for some weird reason. You can see it's got 100% buff chance. Anyway, this is useful mainly in PvP situations, especially if we use Gate of Gunner on turn 1. Suddenly you've got your 2 main attack boosts up in one turn, sets you up to do massive damage from turn 2. Pairs really well with swash builds as well. Be very wary in wars when you see your opponent using this pet. It's a very common swash pet, so expect to receive hard hits early if the AI plays it right. You might need to adjust your strategy accordingly and try to take them out early. Just remember, you definitely don't want to be leaving a Realmshifter at low HP. Okay folks, there we have it. That concludes part 1 of our Thief class progression guide in Orna. We've gone through the classes and skills from tier 1 to tier 10, covered most viable specializations and pets in a decent amount of detail as well. As always, if you have further specific questions, please feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll get around to answering your specific questions as best I can. Be sure to check out part 2 where we cover Thief gearing and atomization options in detail at every tier in the game. If you feel that you learned something useful in this video, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more Orna content. It definitely helps me out and keeps the motivation levels high. Massive thanks for watching. I'm Shabash. See you in the next video. Ciao.